Hey there, history buffs, and welcome to this episode of the History from the Homestead podcast. Today, I am joined by Darin and Mary from the Civil War Breakfast podcast. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So, tell us a little bit about yourselves and your show before we dive in.
Darin, do you want to start us off with that?
Well, we have a podcast, Civil War Breakfast Club. It's been going about 4 or 5 years now, I guess. It's been a while. We talk about all aspects of the Civil War. We try to do it laid back, try to do it more conversational. I think it's what's great about the Civil War is it's a very personal war. There's a lot of good personal stories, and we'll talk about some of those today, I assume. But it's one of those things where people can relate to. Everyone's got a relative. They've got someone they knew. They visited a battlefield. Both sides are in the same country by the end. So it's one of those things where it's easy to gravitate to. And so, being the history nerd I've always been, it's an easy thing to just kind of study and focus on. And then we decided just to start recording episodes, and the rest is history.
Yeah, I like Darin. I've been a Civil War nerd my whole life. And growing up in Canada, I had to be self-taught because we don't learn it in school there. If we do, it's just kind of in passing. So I got into it. My first interest was the Lincoln assassination, because my dad bought me the Civil War, the Time Life books of them, full collection of them. And I got into it from there. And flash forward to 2020, Darin and I start this podcast as kind of a pandemic project, and it's kept going. And we love the personal stories. We love the history of it. We love exploring the battlefields and even going to the cemeteries to find the graves of the generals and the soldiers who fought.
Yeah, and you live in Gettysburg, so you're right in the epicenter of the Civil War. You can't help but see the history. It's everywhere you turn there. There's not much here in the western part of Pennsylvania, but it's funny. We were talking backstage. Gettysburg is where I really kind of fell in love with the Civil War. At the Charleston farm, seeing the barn with the cannonball hole. I've said that before on the show. That if you have even a teeny bit of history, you can't help but let that grab a hold of you and think, wow, that's not something they made. That's been there since 1863. It's
Mhm.
The actual cannonball is actually in the visitor center. You can go see the actual cannonball. So you can put the
really,
other
I
half of that. Yep. It's over in
no
the
kidding.
museum. So you can, next time you come down to Gettysburg, you have to go to the museum and go see our friends over that place, and they'll show you the cannonball. It's pretty cool.
My goodness, I did not even know that. I probably
Mm-hmm.
have seen it and never
Mm-hmm.
never put it together. You know,
Yeah.
it like you were saying, it's if live anywhere pretty much on the eastern seaboard, you're a short drive from the Civil War,
Mhm.
usually somewhere. It's
Yeah.
massive and so many small stories that make up the one big whole.
Yeah. It's kind of like, studying it. You can study the big battles, but they're all parts of campaigns. But then you study the smaller battles. Like we just did an episode about the Battle of Roanoke, and I honestly did not know much about it going into researching it. And coming away from it, you realize like, wow, this little battle has such repercussions for the rest of the Civil War that it's kind of like when you step back from those bigger battles, not that those bigger battles aren't important, but those little small ones, the Roanoke's, and other small battles, they mean a lot when you're studying the Civil War.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's great. That's kind of the premise of my show is to pull out the smaller obscure history that maybe you don't know about. So, and that's what we're going to be talking about of some tonight too is probably some stuff I probably don't know because I am far from a Civil War expert.
Well, I think like so the smaller obscure stories, the stories that get away from the battle, it reminds us that it's humans fighting in this war. And I think when you get away from them, we've always said they're not just like these dots on a map. They're humans. They are going into battles, having to think very fast, but some of them are carrying stuff with them that is not necessarily related to the war. You look at someone like General Sherman at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where he does not have his best day. And you realize that he had just lost his son, you know, I think it was like a month and a bit prior, and he's still, mourning his son. And that likely plays into what happens to him at that battle, because he's not able to focus like he has before.
That's interesting. You don't really think about that, and that you know hundreds of thousands of men on both sides carried probably some form of weight, because you know brother versus brother in some cases, even it's
We've always said that corps are made of divisions, division of brigades, brigades of regiments, regiments of companies, but companies are made of husbands and brothers and sons, and that's really what you really want to focus on, because when you're studying this stuff, it's easy to fall in love with the Robert E. Lees and the U.S. Grants and all these big shot people, but we can't relate to them. We can't, but we can relate to the foot soldiers, the privates, the people who were conscripted, the people who fought because they were too ashamed not to. They couldn't. They had to fight because their whole town was fighting, and just coming out and seeing the plight that these guys did. It's a really easy. You don't want to over romanticize it. It's still war, but you can personify them. You can get an idea of what makes them tick. You go to a battlefield like Gettysburg or in Antietam, or and look at the vistas, and it's almost, in some cases, it's almost exactly the same. You can sit on a rock and look out and make the same decisions that the generals made. You can decide what's great about it. And I grew up in Boston, which is mostly Rev War, and most of it's torn away. It's mostly gone. Here in other parts, if you go west towards Atlanta, places like Georgia, a lot of these things are just really untouched, and you can really appreciate walking the grounds. And you can read all you want, and you can watch as many videos as you want, but until you walk the ground of the battlefields, you really can't appreciate it. And that's what's great about this war, is there's so many battlefields still around. You could actually do that.
I mean, yeah, the one that really is for me is Manassas.
Mm-hmm.
You drive 10 minutes any direction and you're in modern suburbia with strip malls and you name it, but there in the center of all that is this pristine field, which people probably don't realize how close the Manassas battlefield is to our nation's capital now. They don't get that. It's really quite a contrast.
Yeah, and you can go to Manassas. You can stand on Matthews Hill, look down and see where Sullivan Ballou was killed. You can watch you go to Chin Ridge. You can see where Howard fought on the first day. You go to all these places, and it's really what blows my mind in a lot of cases is you read about some of the diaries. Well, I hid in a swale, then we charged up. Then you can go to Antietam, you can find the swale, exactly what he's talking about. And you can charge up yourself. And that's what really brings it home. And I think that's probably why it captures the imagination and the curiosity of so many people, because you see the pictures, there are photographs, you can visit the places. And a lot of times people have relatives who they can associate with, and you sort of fall in love with a regiment or a company, and you expand your knowledge out, and then it gets in your blood, and then it has you. Then you're done, and then you turn into a nerd like us.
Yeah, we're sitting here at 7 o'clock at night talking about the Civil War.
Yeah.
And gratefully so. I would rather do this than just about anything else, because I just love history. But now,
Right.
Mary, you were saying backstage too. You had a few things as well. Obscure little stories that you had dug up, because I didn't really have anything off the top of my head when we first started. So,
Yep, I've got, there's one, it's actually quite fitting. It's, it's from March 22nd, 1864. So it had just turned to spring, and it's in Dalton, Georgia. The soldiers woke up though to 5 inches of snow, which even in this day and age, that would be rare. But back then, that would happen. And so this is Army of Tennessee, led by Joseph E. Johnston, and their winter camp in Dalton. And so General Patrick Cleburne, Confederate general, his division, his one general, Lucius Polk, who is the nephew of the bishop pope that fought in the Civil War. He is going to attack Daniel Govin's brigade, and they have a snowball fight. And Patrick Cleburne gets involved, and he gets captured, and they parole him, and then they go back, they counterattack, and he gets captured again. And this time they joke around with him. They say, well, you broke your parole. We're going to have to punish you. And they're talking about how could they punish him. So they're like, well, let's do his favorite punishment for us, which was carry a fence rail. And they ended up not doing that. Like they were just joking around about it. But they have this big snowball fight, and they turn into, basically they're like big kids for the day. They're not in battle at all. Like they don't have to be there in winter camp, but they just, they have fun with it, because odds are a lot of them probably had never seen that much snow before, because these are like, men from Arkansas, from Texas, the very southern states. And just to know that they're out there having this big snowball fight, and that their commanding general, Patrick Cleburne, is involved, is just one of those things that it's like, it gets you away from the battle. It gets like, this is what these guys are doing in winter quarters, which when you think about it, like they're not always doing battle. Like there's, some of the time they're just sitting around, and this is what they do. And then when it was all over, Cleburne issued an extra whiskey ration to each of his troops, and they all just sat by the campfires that night.
Almost doubly fitting considering the snow they just had down south here recently. Yep. So for anybody that's listening, see, you're not alone. They've had this snow there
Dalton,
before.
Georgia.
Well, that's some great stories, though, or the camp stories. If you read the diaries, Elijah Hunt Rhodes, people like that. There are so many good ones, and a lot of times you have nothing to do in camp, and there are a lot of great stories of they'd play baseball in camps. And so you have a situation where you're sitting around, nothing to do. You're going to have the 2nd Massachusetts going up against the, 59th New York in some camp. They're going to play baseball. And what's neat about it is all the states have their own rules to baseball. It was a home, it was a homespun game, and every state had their own rules, and they didn't all apply. So what would happen? You have a New York regiment playing a Massachusetts regiment. The Mass regiment certainly would have won, Mary. No question about that. But what happened was they would play in their regiments, and they'd have to compare the rules. How do you guys do it? How do we do it? And they'd all get together before the game and do ground rules. And that still happens today. When you watch a Major League Baseball game and you see the managers come out to home plate to talk ground rules and pass the card, that's a tradition that started in the American Civil War. And it's more ornamental now, but you can track it and follow it all the way back. And so you can see our history. Every single day you go to a ball game that goes back to the Civil War, and no one knows it unless you really study it.
Yeah, there was talk that it was Doubleday who invented baseball, which
no, he invented hockey.
Yeah.
People confuse it all the
time. I don't think we really even know who invented baseball, but it was definitely well, as you said, it was from that era, and you think about, you never think about that either. We said before the battles, but in a lot of cases when they had to go anywhere, for example, when Lee, marched for Gettysburg, you can drive from Richmond, Virginia to Gettysburg in a handful of hours, but you're talking days and days and days of marching, of nothing but marching and camping. They had to do something to let off that steam.
Yeah. They couldn't just, they weren't just sitting around like all the time. And like, how many, you think about, they're spending more time in camp, not in battle. So, and that's why, you read the diaries, and a lot of the times the diaries, like they will have like what the weather was and, not overly exciting stuff, but still you can learn a lot from that too, to know what the weather was. Like there's one really good book about the March to the Sea by Noah Andre Trudeau called Southern Storm. And Trudeau went and looked at a whole bunch of diaries. So he had an idea, like each chapter begins with what the weather was on the march. So you can still learn a lot from the diaries with that.
The one consistent diary is like almost everyone talks about the very American tradition of whittling in the woods. They all did it. They all talk about with knives and sticks. That's but it sounds mundane, but I mean it's easy. We've all been camping, we've all sat in the woods, we had a fire going, and um, hopefully never of us have seen too much battle. But I mean this is the reality of it. I mean, it's neat to me. Like there was a Confederate private named Abraham Lincoln. There was a Union general named Jefferson Davis. There was a Confederate general named States Rights Gist. Just little things like that, and it's just you can look back and have so much fun with it. And Jefferson C. Davis, speaking of the March to the Sea, he's famously part of that Ebenezer Creek experience where all those African Americans were drowned. But he's probably more famous for before September 29th of 1862. He finds himself at the Galt House confronting his boss, William Bull Sumner, 300 pounds, full reenactor size, the whole deal, right? And he is confronting him, and Nelson, who is his boss, slaps him across the face and "Get away from me, you puppy," he says. Davis pulls out a gun, shoots and kills him in the hotel lobby. Gets arrested for murder, doesn't get tried because they need generals, and he gets away with it totally. So this is what the Wild Wild West. People always talk about Dan Sickles and killing Barton Key in Washington, D.C., but Jefferson C. Davis would go on to be one of William T. Sherman's subordinate generals in the March to the Sea. And just it's these type of stories that you read this and you just shake your head because it's so alien to us. But back then it's probably a Thursday or a Friday. That's the way life is,
Yeah. Yeah. What'd you do today? Oh, I shot my
Shot a
boss
guy.
and then went off to became a commanding general.
I'm not going to say just anybody's shooting their boss, but I mean, back then you could get away with it.
Yeah, definitely don't do that. Disclaimer, we take no responsibility. If you do that, don't blame us. We have no money. Don't sue us. So,
well, I think too, there's some of these stories and these guys, like, one of our favorites to study, and we've done an episode about him before, is Colonel John Singleton Mosby. One of the Raiders, very interesting guy. We saw a really excellent lecture by Carolyn Janney about him here in Gettysburg. A lot about his post-war career, which, I mean, as interesting as Mosby's Civil War career is, his post-war career is equally interesting. But one of my favorite stories about Mosby is when he was going after General Stoughton in March of 1863. And General Edwin H. Stoughton he's staying in Fairfax at this house, and Mosby and his raiders go in, and a few of them enter the house, and Mosby goes up to the room where Stoughton is sleeping, lifts up the bed sheet and smacks his back with his sword, which wakes Stoughton up. And he has him get out of bed, and Mosby says to him, "Do you know Mosby?" And Stoughton says, "Yes." And then Mosby says something like, "Well, he's got you." And that's how they captured Stoughton. And before they left the house, Mosby takes a piece of charcoal from the fire and writes Mosby, like, just on the wall. And that to me always stands out, like, wow, that would make a great movie. And the interesting thing about that is you can go to the house. You can't go inside it, but you can go there. We've been there with one of our friends, and it still looks the same. We kind of looked inside. You could see the stairs that Mosby would have gone up to find Stoughton. But it's just like one of those stories that's very, like, he didn't realize he'd been captured by Mosby.
Is the charcoal mark still there? I mean, or did it? No, it came off. Darn.
No,
I didn't appreciate truth, the good stuff in time, real time, unfortunately. But yeah, you can go and visit the house, and you can see where he got whacked in the butt. And just imagine you're sleeping in there, and you're trying to catch him, and you knock on the door, and someone walks in and says, "Hey, have you heard of Mosby?" He goes, "Yes, we finally caught the scoundrel." He goes, "No, he just caught you." And get out of bed.
Wow.
It just that's how he was. But it's great. I mean, it's you got to understand people are dying and getting sick and stuff like that. But you would take too much light of it. But it's still there's still fascinating stories. We just did the episode a couple of days ago that Mary mentioned about the Battle of Roanoke Island, February of '62, right before the what would be eventually the Peninsula Campaign. And it was one of the few joint Army-Navy attacks in the war. And this was an important one. Ambrose Burnside is going to take a very vital piece, an island that's going to open up North Carolina and all the canals to Confederate Union gunboats. Well, during the battle, there is a Confederate boat. It's the CSS Curlew. It's a 135 long foot steamer commanded by a guy named Lieutenant Thomas T. Hunter, and his nickname was Tornado Hunter because apparently he was crazy, just a psychotic, and they called him Tornado. Well, the battle starts. It's February 8th in the morning, and they're under attack by a Union gunboat, and they notice that Tornado Hunter is fighting the battle. He's got no pants on, none. And the boat sinks and he survives. But then later, someone asked him about it. And they said, what happened? Why do you have no pants on? And his quote was, well, I thought I put them on in the morning, but I don't remember not putting them on, but I guess I didn't. And it's just a fun story because you just imagine this situation. I never woken up and forgot to put my pants on for work, but apparently that was a thing. But it's stories like that are always fun to talk about too. Even in the heat of battle, you could find something very human about it. That's just fun to talk about.
How do you fight against a guy with no pants on? I mean,
I don't know.
I think I would be laughing, or I don't know. That's
good way to get out of a fight. Next time you're at the bar,
Well, that's the thing. It's like some of the stories are just so like that one was, and I didn't know Darin was going to tell that story when we recorded the episode because we don't we kind of do a little bit of an outline and figure things out a little bit, but for the most part, we don't tell the other what we found out because it's just, I don't know, then you're catching the person off, I guess not off guard, but it was fun to hear.
Like a little historical treasure hunt.
Yeah, exactly. We always try to find the kind of obscure, lesser known stories or whatever, because they're, I mean, like I said, that's how they could become kind of more human to you as well, is if you know those stories that they're out there, this guy's out there fighting a battle with no pants on.
Yep.
But there are tons of bad stories like that. Wilderness Campaign, Saunders Field, there's that really great story of the Union and the Confederates are firing at each other. And there's a Confederate who's in a trench. And the Union guy runs across the field and jumps into the trench. And they both start a fist fight, just swinging like, hockey fight, going at it. It spills out in the field. All of a sudden, both the Union and Confederates all stop shooting and just watch the fight. They stand around, watch these guys throw haymakers for 15, 20 minutes. And they both had agreed the loser of the fight would be the captive of the other one. And they fought and fought. The Confederate guy win. They went back into the trench and he became his prisoner and they all started shooting again. But I mean, boys will be boys, it's just in the heat of the moment, stories like this do pop up. And it's fun reading them in the diaries because you don't hear about these when you read history books. You don't hear these stories like this. But they're all out there waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. Stories too, like the Confederate Union troops across the river, across the way, exchanging tobacco for coffee, whiskey for this. It was because at the end of the day, they were still all Americans. They were fighting each other, but we were still all Americans at the end of the day. And you talk about slavery and why the war happened and whatever, but to those that were carrying the rifles, most of them were just, on average, poor farm folk who were just trying to scratch out a living, and like you said, had no choice in the matter.
Yeah,
and all immigrant, all nationalities, French, Italian, it was a mashup.
It's amazing. Yeah. One of every 4 Union soldiers in the American Civil War was foreign. 25% were Irish or German or Canadian. So, and it was Irish on both sides. It was Canadians on both sides. And so, we have the famous Battle of Fredericksburg. You got the Irish Brigade fighting against the Irish soldiers on Maurice Heights because their immigrant boat happened to land in Savannah instead of New York City. So they fought for the Confederacy years later. You get to go back to the genesis of some of these stories and some of these regiments of how they fell into each other, and it's just an amazing thing to look back and track.
Mm-hmm. And just the friendships, like, even the generals that are friends on either side. And you have, in some cases, you have, you know, I think it was in, Darin will correct me here, when John Reynolds was captured by D.H. Hill, it was 1862, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think. So he gets captured by D.H. Hill because he fell asleep. And there was an exchange between them, and D.H. Hill just says, well, did he say this is the way of war or something? Reynolds is
So
grumbling to him about it.
so is the way of soldiering, and so is the way of war.
Yeah.
And he grumbles, and yeah, it's just so much fun to study this stuff, and no one will never. There's so many stories waiting to be discovered. You'll never know them all, but when you do find a good one, you tend to remember them, no question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll remember the no pants story. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's tough. That's tough. What's up?
We're back to that again.
Yeah. It always goes back to no pants. Welcome to my world.
It's just supposed to be a family-friendly show, but
well, I think and I mean, speaking of that, is that, like, family friendly and all that, but like one thing that I've always found fascinating, I know kids are into this too, is the horses. Because the horses have their own individual stories. And my favorite one is probably General Meade's horse, Old Baldy, who he was wounded many times on the battlefield. Meade actually found, when he was found, I think it was at Antietam, he had been wounded and basically left behind because he belonged to a Confederate general and left behind. So Meade took him for his own horse. And he's riding Baldy at the Battle of Gettysburg. And the two of them were like, I mean, the horse has almost become an extension of the general's personality in a way. Like Sheridan's horse, Rienzi, was very feisty, and the only person that was allowed around him was Sheridan. And Baldy was a little bit, like Meade, like I think a little bit methodical and all that. So Baldy and Meade are out there July 2nd, 1863, and Baldy suddenly gets hit on one of his flanks. And for the first time ever, he would not move forward in battle. And Meade said, oh, Baldy's really injured. I can't ride him. He's never not moved forward before. So for the rest of the battle, rest of July 2nd and July 3rd, Meade rode one of his secondary horses. But in his letters to his wife, Margaretta, after that, he writes that he's very worried that Baldy is not going to survive. And you can hear in his letters how much that horse means to him, that it's more than just a horse. It's like, it is like a pet, like one of our pets are today. It is like a friend. And then after the war, so after that, Meade took Baldy out of service after that, because he realized the horse had been through enough. So he went to live on the farm of a family friend. And after the war, Meade and Baldy would go riding, just the two of them. And this is my own opinion on it. I think it's because the two of them had this shared experience. And Meade was able to just go and ride Baldy. And for that was a bond with them and a connection they had. And it was relaxing for him to be out with this horse that they had shared so much together on the field of battle. And you can go see Meade and Baldy today at Gettysburg. That's the statue over by the Angle. I see it every day when I drive home from work, which I'm very happy to be able to see that. But that's one of that's another more human story. And it also involves the horses who get forgotten when we're studying the Civil War as well.
And some of them, like General Nathan Bedford Forrest, didn't have any really bonds. He had 29 horses shot from under him during the Civil War, and he obviously never got killed. He was a lucky guy. But you know what his birthday was? Friday the 13th. Nathan Bedford Forrest, and he survived 29 shots getting shot. So February 13th, 1821, he was born. He was shot out from 29 horses and never got wounded. So he, wow. I guess that dispels that unlucky day, no question.
Yeah. You mentioned the horses too, and you can see that across, because you think about where Lee's buried down at VMI. Mm-hmm. Traveler is buried right there, which was Lee's horse. You can see Stonewall Jackson's horse taxidermied in the museum, which I recommend anybody in Lexington, Virginia, swing by VMI. It's not a huge museum, but there's some really good stuff packed in there.
Yeah, and you can see Rienzi Sheridan's horse is at the Smithsonian. And that was a horse that was originally from Port Huron, Michigan. It was purchased for a guy that was going into the cavalry there, and he and the horse did not get along. The horse was not a nice horse. But then when they were out in, I think it was Rienzi, Mississippi, or Missouri, Sheridan saw this horse and said, well, that's a really nice horse. And the horse and Sheridan took to each other. And the guy's like, you know what? He's all yours because he's a menace. And Sheridan had Rienzi for the rest of the war. He rode him, a famous ride to Cedar Creek. He's on Rienzi. And then afterwards, the horse gets christened with the name of Winchester. But in his memoirs, Sheridan does write, after that, my horse was called Winchester, but I always knew him as Rienzi. And he's a gigantic horse. I don't know how Sheridan, he was 5'4". I don't know how he got on that horse. He would have had to use a step stool.
Was the same as Stonewall. He was, little Sorrel. He was on a little horse. And so he had to deal with that. So it's kind of, men used to laugh about that. And they'd see this guy, Stonewall Jackson. He was famously didn't drink alcohol ever. And one day he's with the guy, his doctor, Dr. McGuire, who would be the same doctor who would basically pronounce him dead not too long later when he was shot over here in Chancellorsville. But there was a cold epidemic running through the camp one time. And he was suggesting everyone should drink some whiskey to prepare for the cold. And Jackson wouldn't do it. He finally decided to do it. He never had whiskey before. And they said, well, I'll drink a little bit of whiskey. And they gave him a pretty good sized cup. And the story McGuire tells is he downed it like a big shot, and didn't even flinch. And I guess went to his head pretty quickly. And all the men had a good time with it because they got to see Stonewall Jackson kind of a little tipsy. But that's a fun story too, because they said basically, he said, doctor, do you think this will really help me not get it? He goes, I think it will. Well, I'll do it then. And they just went Bluto from Animal House on it, just down the whole thing. He never had it before, so he figured, this is how I drank it. Guess went right to his head, and some of the men had a good time laughing at him. But it's the one alcohol story that Stonewall has. Speaking of Jackson.
Wow. Excuse me.
Yeah, I never heard that. I've never heard that
No,
story.
really?
Jackson did that.
Yeah. I knew he was a teetotaler, but yeah, I'd never heard that part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good. Well, there was a few of them that were that way. Like Patrick Clayburn didn't. He didn't really drink at all or anything. He was just, and I mean, the thing with Clayburn is you're looking at an Irish guy who served in the British Army, settles originally in Ohio, and the only reason he moves to Arkansas is because he was working for a guy in Ohio, and that guy's like, hey, I'm opening a store in Arkansas. Can you go manage it for me? And Clayburn's like, sure. And because of that, we have Clayburn ending up fighting for the South. And he had siblings and half siblings who fought for the North. I know he had one brother who fought for the South, who was unfortunately, he was killed. But that's why you have like Clayburn finding his home in Arkansas, and that's why he fought there. And that's where he really finally found home, was there.
Wow. And thinking too, is something else maybe we could touch on even briefly with the Civil War. It was kind of a war of, lack of a better way to describe it, sort of its own little industrial revolution. There was so much in the way of armament and such that made its great debut in the war that really increased the casualty level, the repeating rifles and so on and so forth, because they, the old way to fight was the way they fought: line up and shoot, march, charge. And then all of a sudden you throw in rifles that could accurately fire hundreds of yards, and it could fire 12 shots a minute or whatever.
Well, it's scary because you saw the birth of the American railroad system in the Civil War. You saw the birth of the American Navy. But, you just hinted at, the war starts and you've got this Napoleonic style massing your fire. And the Civil War had been brewing for years. John C. Calhoun, 1830s, was talking about it. And people always talk about the weapons, but I always think about this, though. What if this thing spilled a few more years? What if this happened in the early 1900s? You deal with mustard gas and airplanes, how the American Civil War could have been different. And so it was bad, but you think about it, you don't want to say happen at the right time, but if it's going to happen, but you do it while it's still manageable, because 50 years is not a long time between World War One and the American Civil War. You think of the what if, how that could have been. We never would have got over that.
Yeah, and you see the beginnings of trench warfare in the Civil War. It happens at the Battle of Chickamauga, and it also, especially in the Petersburg campaign, those last campaigns of the Civil War in the Eastern Theater, you see the trench warfare beginning. So the style of war is changing, and you had some generals like General PGT Beauregard. He struggles in the Civil War because he wants to be so Napoleonic, because that's what he knows from West Point. And he was so textbook and he couldn't adapt. It's like he had a tough time adapting that. And then you have generals like, especially like US Grant, who are adapting to that new style of warfare. And two, you see the hard warfare, the total war that is waged by General Sheridan in the Shenandoah Valley in 64, as well as by Sherman's March to the Sea. So even that changes as well. But as you said, like you have the Spencer repeaters that they really get showcased in the Western theater to begin with John T. Wilder and his Lightning Brigade.
The Gatling gun come along too. Siege warfare, siege weapons, long short artillery, case shot. I mean, you had a lot of nasty stuff that was just the nascent stages of mass destruction. It's when you look and you go to some of these museums and you see some of these, there's a piece of fence line over here from Pickett's Charge museum, and it's like 8 feet long, and it's just a piece of fence line. It's got about 30 or 40 bullet holes in it. That was right along the side of the road, and that's just bullets. That's just mini balls. So it's crazy to think about it. It really, really is.
It makes you wonder how anybody survived.
Yeah.
I think the old saying was that, basically you had to fire a man's weight in lead till you hit anything with those. And, to a degree, maybe, because it's just, like you said, that fence rail, it's full holes. So you think of some of the witness trees at Gettysburg and various places, how many mini balls are buried in them.
Yeah.
Oh, I can only imagine. There's probably a ton, but there was certainly a lot. And then when you start looking at some of the Western theater, Overland campaign stuff, and then the Eastern theater with Overland, is how brutal it was. And Mary, you talked about this changing styles. Robert E. Lee never really changed with the style. Are you a Steeler fan, Tom? Western Pennsylvania. You know who
Absolutely.
You know who Dick LeBeau is?
I do.
Okay, Dick LeBeau is a defensive coordinator for the Steelers, and he never changed. He did what he did. That was the quote. And when the Patriots played them, they toyed with them because they knew exactly what he was going to do, and he never changed. That was Robert E. Lee. Grant knew what he was going to do, so Grant had changed with the times, but Lee didn't, and so he was able to force him back to Petersburg because Lee still thought that he was trying to capture the flag at Richmond when Grant was targeting him personally. He never figured that out. So the great generals adapt to it, and this is on both sides. And sometimes that West Point stigma will hold you back. And that's why we saw some of the best generals in this war not go to West Point, the Claibornes of the world, right? Because they had to learn on the fly and they had to understand they didn't have that Jomini, Mahan in their head. They had to unlearn as the war got. When we started the war, we're talking Napoleonic style. By 64, it's trench warfare. It's Indian style fighting. And that's a big sea change. And if you're not the type who likes to change, you're gonna fall back, no question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's like, speaking of Patrick Claiborne at the Battle of Shiloh, he realized that if he'd had sharpshooters, he might have been able to take out the Union artillery a bit more. So in the downtime after Shiloh, he trained some of his men to be sharpshooters, and they will specifically target, unfortunately, the artillery horses, because if you don't have your horses, you can't move your artillery. And he recognized that, if I'd been able to do this at Shiloh, I might have been able to make more headway. So it's that kind of adaptability. And whereas you have, like I said before, Beauregard could not break out of that, the Jomini and the Clausewitz that he'd learned at West Point. He had trouble with that. But as Darin said, some of the ones that were able to break away from that, they adapted and changed the style of warfare.
Yeah, and it, you think about time too. I was thinking about this earlier, and I think we will broach the subject. We were talking about Grant down, Richmond and the siege of Petersburg and everything. How would that have turned out if he had been? Because everybody claims how aggressive he was at that. How would that have turned out had he not been aggressive or as aggressive? It definitely, the biggest problem that the Confederates had there was the lack of munitions, which if they didn't have to fire it so much, they could have made a lot more. There were munitions factories yet Gettysburg, yeah, in Richmond. So you wonder about stuff like that as well. Had Grant not been as aggressive, had Sherman not been as aggressive, what may have happened?
Well, if there's a lot of what ifs with this. I mean, the problem with the Army of the Potomac and the armies in the East at the time is they were running out of men too, and so you started to see men from the heavy artillery, guys like the 8th New York, who'd been guarding forts the entire war. Now they're a Cold Harbor charging the breastwork. So they were the aggressiveness definitely got Grant, but they realized, okay, well, we need to end this war. The only way now is to just is throw it against the wind. At the grand finale at the 4th of July, hit them with everything all at one time, and that's what we're going to have to do. And that's eventually, obviously, what they did. But if they bled him out a little bit, it would have gone on and on and on.
Yeah.
And so if Lee didn't surrender at Appomattox, like some people did, like E.P. Alexander wanted, they would have gone into the mountains and fought as bushwhackers and guerrillas for the next 10 years. And Lee said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to put the country through that. So there comes a point when you have to kind of know when to hold them and know when to fold them, as someone once said, right? And Grant knew what he had to do, and Lee knew what he had to do to survive. But Grant he had the numbers, he had the manpower, he had cut the railroads, forced Fisher to fall on. They had no more supplies. So it was a matter of time. And I think that's a big reason why he let him up slowly with Lincoln after the fact, and why there was no tribunals and hangings and they let's get the country back together again. And Lee, fortunately for the Confederate side and the countryside, he acquiesced to that. He knew that was enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess gratefully so, because you could see what happened in the Wild West in Texas, and that the for lack of a better word, the renegade bands of Confederates who just refused to give it up.
Yeah.
And it had not so much an effect other than to continuously harass and get people killed when it was just unnecessary to do so.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know when the game's over. You
exactly.
Have to, even if you don't like it, there comes a point when you have to, if the team's taking a knee, the game's over. You don't want it to be over, but unfortunately, it's the way life goes.
It is.
Yeah. And so, I think the last Confederate army surrendered a few months after Lee in the Western Theater. And you had, Joseph E. Johnston, like they thought they had the surrender terms hammered out with Sherman, and then Sherman sends it back to Washington and they're like, no, we're not doing this. You have to go back to him again. And at that point, they already knew Lincoln had been assassinated. So I can't imagine what that was like for Sherman, thinking he's doing the right thing. And then it's like, well, you got to go back again. It's like, well, are we going to keep fighting, or what are we going to do? And luckily,
there, imagine the turmoil had, the Civil War been in full swing when Lincoln was assassinated.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. The Confederates tried. Mm-hmm. They certainly tried. That's one of my favorite quotes. Get down, you damn fool.
Yeah.
Had that succeeded, my goodness, what a mess that may have been.
Yeah, that's it's still obviously tragic what happened. Like, just terrible. Like, one of the worst things to happen to the country at the worst possible time. And I think it changed a lot of how things could have gone and all that. But yes, thankfully it didn't happen in the middle of the war, because that probably would have been even more devastating.
just that's why I believe things happen for a reason when they're supposed to, and
Mhm,
that's just the way it is. So,
mhm.
um,
There's
and I
there's
you
a
know,
there's a lot of like you said, there's a lot of great quotes from this war.
yeah,
It's a lot of them. My favorite is when Jeb Stuart's father-in-law, um, he was Philip St. George Cook, who was a Union cavalryist. He was both from Virginia, and they stayed with. He went to the Union, and obviously Stuart stayed with the Confederates. And Jeb was married to his daughter, and someone asked him about his decision to fight for the Union. And in my opinion, it's the greatest quote, and I use it at work all the time. He said he'll regret that decision just once, and it'll be continuously. I love that. It's my favorite quotes from the Civil War because it's one you can use today, and it shows the width of some of these people and then just the personalities. And we can go on all day with these stories like that, but it's just so much fun to read them because they're young guys and they're people. They didn't talk like we read today. They don't sit there and say, "So, how was your valor this morning, sir?" Like that's not how they talked. They just were regular dudes,
yeah,
and they laughed and they had fun and they did their things. And there's regular people, and when you see them that way, they're very relatable.
yeah.
Mhm.
Get get there fastest with the mostest.
Yeah,
That's that kind of sums up what you more likely would have heard
Yeah,
than
yeah,
anything.
yeah.
Um, well, and and like you said, we could go on all night. We've already chewed up, my goodness, how much time. Before we get off, where can we find your podcast at?
So we have a Facebook page, just it's called Civil War Breakfast Club Podcast and Forum. We are also on YouTube, Apple, Podbean, Spotify, any place where you can get your audio podcast. We have Instagram and Twitter as well. And I think we're on Blue Sky, aren't we, Darin?
oh yeah, Blue
And
Sky.
Threads. Yes, we're
And
on
oh
all of
god,
them.
yeah, do all of it. But the podcast is fun. You know, just like this, we do a YouTube, and then we drop it that night, and then we usually do an audio that drops a couple days later. And then then we'll get together and do a YouTube live the weekend after, just kind of talk about it. People will come on and we can catch up with them and try to do stuff like that. Try to build a community and try. And the good part about the Civil War is there's people like you guys and other friends who you can sit and talk about just like this. But the bad side is in our real world, there's not many people like this. End up being the town kook if you talk about this stuff in public at work. So you have to bring people together in a community that can, judgmental free, north, south, whatever you want to talk about, to get people talking about it and learn by talking and having fun with it. And by getting as many outlets out there and doing it and just trying to tell as many fun stories and interesting, cool stories, you can really create that thirst for knowledge, that intellectual curiosity to get people to want to study this stuff and to keep these memories alive with these people.
Yeah, and that's the one thing we wanted to do is like the community that grew around this was not expected. It just happened. And we do a roundtable every month or so, just on Zoom, have people come on and talk about the Civil War. And it's just kind of like, we want to say it's like a safe space, like judgment-free zone for people to come on and talk about, whatever side you want, whatever general you want. And just know that you're not going to be judged for it. And we have great conversations with people. We've met so many great people doing this. So it's been like an amazing experience with it.
Yeah, I recommend everybody hop over and listen to it. If you have even an inkling interest in the Civil War, you will find something on their show. I guarantee it.
Thank you.
So,
Appreciate that. Thank you.
I thank both of you for joining me. It was that time just flew. That was a wonderful show.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you
Yeah,
so much for
we
this.
and we definitely appreciate having us on. That's very kind of you.
So, thank you again, both.